heard way too much from me already, so I'm going to keep it brief. I just in some very intense discussions over the break, just wanted to clarify a couple of things. I may have glossed the best interest discussion a little bit, just because we're covering a lot of territory. But I want to be really, really clear about this. The best interest model and approach is completely problematic and has been part of the system of paternalism for people with disabilities. I suggested, I think, in my glossing that there are some better, when you look at them in more detail, some much better sort of tests of best interest than others. But I think that the point here is that we need to ground this in a person's will and preferences, which goes back to the very core of the presentation that I was making and is at the core of Article 12. And there's so much slippage in application of best interests, which is why we've dropped the language altogether. The whole thing in terms of determining whether a supporter is in fact acting according to the will and preferences of a person needs some very clear, articulate criteria and obligations stated, because this whole thing won't work unless we do that, and we don't have those models fully developed yet. The other thing I wanted to say is, in dividing I don't want to suggest that conceptualization of different ways of exercising legal capacity should now just holus bolus be turned into a framework, and we should start assessing people across the country to figure out what box they fit into. That's not what I'm suggesting in terms of implementation. The starting point is, as Article 12 says, there's an assumption of legal capacity. We all have it. It can't be taken away. That right has been recognized without discrimination on the basis of disability. I think the second point is the presumption, in law generally it says there's a presumption of capacity to act. No, we have the right. That's recognized. The presumption should be that we exercise it legally independently. That's the presumption. And that we do it in relation to having access to support and accommodation. And it's other parties are going to have to push pretty far to suggest that someone doesn't have that capacity. And it's only at that point where there's a dispute that someone may need to have supporters appointed. Others may decide they want to go out and get supporters appointed right away. My only point is the presumption is that we act legally independently with sometimes extensive supports. I wanted to, Gerard had asked if I would share some examples of work that we're doing around the world and engaged in. And when I say we, I mean people in this room and various collaborations and networks of people. Because governments are trying to figure out how to implement Article 12. And this is such a critical article for people, I think especially people with intellectual disabilities and psychosocial disabilities in their organizations, because it goes to the core of how they're recognized in society and to the core of the reason why they've been so denied and excluded. So there's a lot of work going on, and I'm not going to go, you'll be thankful, through my 85 slides or something. I want to just, actually, you know what I might do is this PowerPoint's available on how do I do this? No, I know technically what I need to do, I think. Oh, except I just lost this now. Elaine. Elaine. Can someone help me with this? I'm so used to having a mouse available. Just to get it back up to the slideshow. Oh, there's a mouse. Oh, thank you. Right, the mouse was sliding. So there's initiatives, and these are only initiatives that I have some awareness about, right? So we've been working with the Open Society Foundation that's been working in various regions of the world and supporting work in various regions of the world. BSHOOT, the Israel Human Rights Center for People with Disabilities, working on guardianship reforms. That's a major issue, and they've been working on litigation. various successes and challenges. Zambia Federation of Disability Organizations. I think Milika, is Milika here? There she is. Milika, who works with the Zambian Federation of Disability Organizations. They're working on mental health law reform primarily. That's where they've seen sort of the greatest potential and where there's opportunity. And they have in place a government and civil society working group that is writing a new mental health act. But it's basically still within the usual model, trying to move it to be more compliant with Article 12, but I think there's a long way to go. And we're talking in that initiative about how to focus more on building the capacity of the community and mental health supports in the community in order to make the resort to the provisions of the Mental Health Act less frequent. And a number of the initiatives have really been focusing on empowerment of users and ex-users of psychiatric services. And this is a picture of the Mental Health Users Network of Zambia, started by Sylvester Katontoka. And so I think, going back to an earlier point, a lot of the work, I think, has to be about building the capacity of organizations to lay claim to their right to legal capacity and to engage with governments in the process of reform. We're not going to get there just by a legal framework. The All-Ukrainian NGO Coalition for People with Intellectual Disabilities. Here's an individually focused initiative working with government, but it's single disability focused. Again, to work on guardianship issues and legal reform. RUSIHAC, the Human Rights Mental Health Initiative, where I just was. Again, they're going on mental health law reform. That's going to be the way into Article 12, and we just had a symposium there. But again, it's they don't have a mental health law. And we were urging them, and others have, like, do you need to go down this path? They said, well, actually, the World Health Organization has told us that all countries need to have a mental health law, so now they're going down that act. Or going down that path, and it's too far to switch it. So how do we do a mental health law reform that's as progressive as possible? But you see how we end up going down a path by the limits of our imagination, which is why, again, I think going back to our conversation this morning and Gerard's point about, the obligations of conduct, what are the obligations of states parties around the conduct in relation to a comprehensive planning process so that we can keep reform alive? Peru, dealing with voting rights of people with intellectual disabilities, and I'm going to go through these very quickly. This is a Mad Pride organization in Croatia, working on self-advocacy. The Bulgarian Center for Not-for-Profit Law, very interesting process led by a government-led, and I was just in Bulgaria, led by the Department of Justice, working group led by the Deputy Minister of Justice, incredibly impressive woman who's brought community and senior policymakers from across government together, and they're creating a new legal framework for the civil code. And are creating the concept, much along the lines, in fact, that we've been talking about this afternoon, that would provide for the range of supported decision-making, representation, community-based support. So that's, and they've had various processes. I want to just go to a couple of slides at the end. This is the Czech Republic doing litigation, MDAC, Mental Disability Advocacy Center, doing a lot of work on research on guardianship. I just want to move right to the end so that we can sort of get a sense of the variety of strategies going on. We pulled together, a number of these initiatives came together to meet in Madrid in November from these various countries. And it was really about trying to uncover an emergent theory of change. And again, Gerard referred to this as well yesterday. What's our theory of change moving forward? What's our theory of change on Article 12? And this is, if you look at the variety of ways in which people are working, some are working at making Article 12 real in actual people's lives. A number of initiatives like the Bapu Trust in India, looking at developing community-based mental health support, while others are looking at law reform. This organization is looking at community-based mental health services. Others are looking at developing the capacity of families to understand the right to legal capacity for their family members. And others are looking at working at a systems level around law reform. What they're encountering are a number of barriers that are preventing advance. Knowledge gap among provincials, legal barriers in the civil code, as people in this room know about. The medical model entrenched in everything from mental health law to the guardianship law. Political barriers, isolation of people, lack of resources. We did a kind of review, of kind of mini study around these initiatives, and those were the kind of key barriers. The range of areas in which people are working to advance Article 12 really speaks to that picture of a comprehensive approach that I mentioned earlier. We've got efforts that identify themselves as Article 12 efforts working on voting rights. Contract law is now in Uganda, criminal law, the justice system, community supports, mental health law, etc. And a huge variety of strategies, from awareness raising, research, community development, pilot projects to make supported decision-making real on the ground, etc. We don't have time to go into those in detail, and at breaks and at various times, if you're interested in any of those initiatives, we can talk in more detail about it. And there are people here that are involved in some of them. I've been trying to figure out what are the kind of vectors of change, and if we think about what are the dynamics at play in reform. And I think there, for me, as I look at it now, there are kind of two broad vectors. There's where is leadership coming from for reform, and what is the focus for reform? And if you look across those initiatives, there's disability-specific organizations trying to drive reform, like the All-Ukrainian Coalition of NGOs working on intellectual disability. There's a variety of cross-disability initiatives where the investment has really been built in building links between people with psychosocial disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and the broader community, as in the Zambia Federation. And engaging also with other civil society groups like the Bulgarian Center for Not-for-Profit Law, which is really leading the reform and is not a disability organization in the first place. They see themselves as a human rights organization, but they have the strongest relationships with government. So they've been able to be a real leader in opening up this civil society state level partnership. And then state party reform, where states parties themselves have taken the initiative. Small story in Canada. We were working on the Minister of Finance because they crafted a new tax provision for disability savings to enter, and you got all kinds of benefits if you opened up the plan. But to open up the plan, you had to have contractual capacity. So we pushed on him and said, this is in violation of the convention. You've just made a tax provision in violation of the convention. And so and he said, well, it's under civil rights at the provincial level. They're the ones that regulate it. And we said, you know, you've got to take leadership on this. So what he did is he opened up for 4 years. The Minister of Finance in the Income Tax Act opens up a window for 4 years. People can enter supported decision-making arrangements to open those plans, and then it closes. He's giving basically provinces 4 years to rewrite their legal frameworks so that people can open these plans. So I thought it was a very interesting political leadership by a state party. There's a number of initiatives around community capacity, as I said. Colombia is one where they're working in civil society to mobilize people to think through a process, to go through a process to think through what a comprehensive legal framework would look like, and then they're going to play a role in doing strategic litigation. So they're moving down into Omnibus Law Reform, right? We've got leadership across the top, some that are focusing on community capacity, specific law reform like voting rights, guardianship, mental health law. Others are focusing on the legal capacity framework itself, like Bulgaria. We don't have anyone doing omnibus law reform or that comprehensive approach. But there are some that are beginning to move from their work in civil society, those ones up in this cell here, Croatia, Zambia, Peru, Argentina, to try and move into build state party leadership for reform. And then others who are working on the legal capacity framework which is a bit more comprehensive. And I don't know if Ireland is there. I put Ireland there. A number of NGOs trying to move the broader framework forward. And we're seeing some, I understand we're going to hear from the state party about leadership in that regard very shortly. But I think we want to eventually move down into this cell where we've got across disability working on a broad framework. Goes back to the earlier point. We don't even know what that cell down there looks like yet. So we don't have states parties that can meet their full obligations under Article 12. We should never, I don't think we're in we shouldn't pretend. We've got a number of initiatives that are kind of beginning to move in that direction. We need to really start articulating, to use Gerard's statement of the obligation this morning, I think, the obligation of conduct. What is the responsibility of states parties to establish a process that can begin to move us in that direction, given that we can't fully imagine it now? But we could articulate a process. We could create requirements for a process. We could begin to develop benchmarks. We've got some concepts that we can test it against. And I think that's really what we need to begin. And we can imagine what those processes would look like. We've got a lot of lessons coming from around the world about what works. It needs to be cross-disability. It needs to be cross-disability. And I think some of the most effective work is where governments have actually created processes to sit down with civil society in the drafting process, in the conceptualization process, not the usual prepare a brief and go to the committee and prepare your brief and then have feedback and then government goes back into its world. There's really interesting, very productive examples of negotiation and co-production of a framework to move legal capacity forward. I'm going to leave it there.
Good. Very good.